So it is a super light crowd today, and I'm assuming that is because most people are still in turkey coma. So it's the week after, that it's raining too. It's the first real rain of the season this week, which, thank goodness we needed it. But it's the week after Thanksgiving, and I hope you all enjoyed your meals, if that's a tradition that you partake in. But I also want to challenge us to remember the pain that is associated with that holiday for many people. You see, some people have lost loved ones, and they don't have family that they can share that time with. And others have been shunned by their family. So some people have they've lost loved ones, they don't have a family they can share that time with, but others have been shunned by their families, or they're so abused by their family that they don't feel safe attending those festivities because they will be shamed for their sexual identity or misgendered. And it's a rough time for some people. And then there are those that cannot celebrate Thanksgiving because of the trauma that their native ancestors endured. You see, when I first moved to Santa Cruz, I was playing a gig at a local coffee establishment just a few blocks away from my home on the west side. And after the gig was over, I asked the owner of the establishment if they had any plans with their family for Thanksgiving. And she said, well, you see, my father was native and my family grew up in abject poverty on a reservation, so we will definitely not intend on planning any celebrations this time of year. It's a rough day for my family. And up until that point in my life, I had never considered this being the case for people. I never considered it before, and from that day forward, my friends and I have done Friendsgiving on a day other than that Thursday as a way for me to remember that it's a painful day for some people. Now, I'm not asking you to do the same thing, but I am asking that at minimum, in the future, we acknowledge the pain that Native people have endured and recognize the slow and gradual cultural execution and genocide that this country is still putting them through. Now, in regards to today's lesson, in the spirit of feasting, I figured that for today's sermon, we could discuss meals. So today's scripture says this. It says, it so happened that Jesus was reclining for dinner in his house, along with many toll collectors and sinners. And Jesus' disciples, you see, there were many of these people, and they were all following him. And whenever the Pharisee scholars saw him eating with sinners and toll collectors, they would question his disciples, what's he doing eating with toll collectors and sinners? When Jesus overhears this, he says to them, since when do the able-bodied need a doctor? It's the sick who do. I did not come to enlist the upright, but sinners. Now the toll collectors and sinners kept crowding around Jesus so they could hear him, but the Pharisees and the scholars would complain to each other, this guy welcomes sinners and eats with them. Now, this is what we do here. We take a few minutes and we have you talk about your observations with one another. If you could, I think you're all pretty close. If you want to break into two groups or just one group, that's fine. Take a few minutes, talk about this verse, and we'll come back and share those thoughts collectively in just a moment. So I'm trying to transition smoothly. All right, what did y'all talk about in the group? Would love to hear. I know you guys heard it. I didn't get the pleasure of hearing it, so.
We were just saying, because, like you said, a sick person doesn't, or a well person doesn't need a doctor. Therefore, he's reaching out to people who need help more than people that are saved already. Or I feel like he's going to people who are going to actually benefit the most from his teachings, and people who are just going to be like, okay, whatever, I don't know. So that was kind of what you're talking about. You can have your spiel.
Well, I pointed out that great commentator on sin, Billy Joel, has a song called Only the Good Die Young, and it has the great lyric, I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. The sinners are much more fun. And I think this passage, and I don't know where the passage that accuses Jesus of hanging out with drunkards, in a way that suggests that not only did he hang out with them, he partook. And that, I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints has an additional layer of meaning in the parallel passage.
And I think it's kind of a slam to against these people. Like, how often in church could you walk in America and say something like, we're welcoming folks that are on the margins in most churches, but what's not welcome here is white supremacy. Like, how often could you get away with that with so many churches? You couldn't, and that's the thing, is like, there's so many people that are ostracized from the community that shouldn't be, and so many people that are leading the community that also shouldn't be. So I wonder if this is kind of a critique on that too. Very good.
See that the white supremacy is the financial foundation of independent churches.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've literally worked in churches where you could not say something to that effect. Like back when I worked in the mega church, you couldn't question the war in Iraq, because if you did, all the people with the money were going to take their toys and go home, and the entire foundation of the church was dependent on these fragile, rich white folks giving 10% of their money, because if they didn't get a paycheck. Yes?
That is true in mainline Protestant churches as well.
Yeah.
When I was, in such a congregation and ours, we were all saying the same things every single Sunday, and then some of them were supporting the war and voting for George Bush, and I couldn't keep doing that.
Because we don't want to offend anyone. Because that's the flip side of the coin, right? With progressive churches, we want everyone to be welcome and included, which, in an ideal world, that's awesome, but sometimes things need to be slightly offensive. I don't really care if I offend people that are bigoted. We should offend them, because right now we're enabling them if we don't. So very good stuff, good conversation. The thing that I think we all noticed here is that Jesus often made room at his table for those that religious institution declared to be immoral. Okay, tax collectors and prostitutes were not among those that religious authority admired, right? And Jesus made a point not only to include them, but to criticize the religious hierarchy of his day that excluded them. Now, why would he do this? And I think if we think about it logically, I don't know that we can really know, but I think there might be a few reasons why Jesus may have done this. First and foremost, Jesus was building a grassroots movement. It said that a house that's divided against itself cannot stand, and at the time, the Jewish people, they had their land taken from them, and they wished to reclaim it, right? But like today, their peoples were extremely divided on small theological issues. Now, we're not talking about major political issues of inclusivity. We're talking about small theological issues like many churches are divided on today. And the question that Jesus must have asked himself and must have asked his followers often is, how are you going to build a movement of people capable of accomplishing such a daunting task as tearing down an empire if you are constantly creating ways to exclude other people and keep folks that are suffering under the boot of oppression on the margins as well? And you can't, is reality. So Jesus was building a movement that was drawing a wider circle around all folks that were oppressed by Rome, and including some of those that were kind of problematic in their society too. And this is interesting. And I'm not talking about the sex workers, okay? They weren't the problem. I'm talking about the tax collectors. They were the problem. You see, tax collectors, compared to other Jewish citizens, were benefiting from the occupation of Rome. But compared to Roman officials, there was still quite a bit of disparity in regards to wealth with tax collectors. And this is why modern efforts like the Poor People's Campaign, started by Dr. King and now led by William Barber, are so important. The Poor People's Campaign is a grassroots movement that is uniting poor folks of all races, all gender identities, faith identities, sexual identities, and political persuasions in the fight against economic injustice. Now, if you have not had the pleasure of hearing Dr. William Barber preach, he's actually going to be in San Francisco December 11th. And there's going to be more details on that come. I got the event page from a friend of mine that's involved with the event. We're going to share it on our Facebook page, so pay attention, because if you have not heard Dr. Barber preach, you really, really need to. Now, secondly, Jesus was calling out the problems within faith communities that is still prevalent today. Judgment. How often in faith communities are others excluded based on their choices to not choices, but based on their identity and based on the people that they naturally love? How often are people excluded based on their choices of who they vote for, if they vote Democratic or Republican, right? Far too often. Jesus, the best that I can tell, spent his career as a rabbi trying to address this issue by including those that were marginalized. I have a Facebook friend that is a minister, and her name is Jory Micah. And she has spoken out quite a bit against sexist evangelical preachers and authors like John MacArthur and John Piper due to their recent claims that feminism is evil and that women ministers should go home. I mean, they actually said this. It was kind of disgusting. And Jory, who's an amazing minister, she spoke out against it. And the amount of hate that she has received is unreal, to the point that she was in tears due to the overwhelming number of conservative evangelical asshats that were contacting her and telling her to go home and get back in the kitchen. Totally disgusting. But I have to say that if Jesus saw that kind of exclusive and tolerant behavior of these sexist men, he would not tell them to go home. He might tell them to go to hell, but I don't think he would tell them to go home. So I would like to close out this section regarding our observations by saying this. It's an all too common scenario in which verses like these are used in evangelical and even progressive mainline circles to teach tolerance of the intolerant, right? It's an all too common scenario for people to use verses like these to instruct people to intentionally be around abusive spouses, abusive parents, abusive siblings, and other relatives, especially this time of year. And people cherry pick these verses and are like, I thought you were a Christian. What about this? You should totally share a meal with these people. And that could not be further from the context of this segment of Scripture. Jesus is dining with people that were not tolerated by those in his faith community. But we must also acknowledge that in other verses, he condemned those that are judging them, judging others in the Scriptures as well. And based on what we quite often hear in church, this seems like a contradiction. That is because moderate and even many progressive churches have reimagined a Jesus that was non-confrontational, a Jesus that was a total pacifist, and that Jesus never existed. What we do see in the Scriptures is a Jesus that did not tolerate intolerance, a Jesus that called out abusers of power and bullies. And I challenge us in these trying times to do the same. People of all faith identities, political backgrounds, sexual identities, gender identities, they are welcome and they are affirmed in their identities at this church, and they will be until if I have anything to say about it with my dying last breath, that will be how things are here. And because of that, we have a zero tolerance policy on intolerance. Because not tolerating intolerance is the paradox of tolerance, y'all. Having a tolerant society means that we cannot tolerate those that wish to obliterate others, those that wish to exclude others, those that wish to oppress others. If you want a tolerant society, don't tolerate intolerance. That's how it goes. So, time for application. Talk about this amongst yourselves, and we'll come back and discuss how we can apply these verses in just a few minutes. So, what did you all talk about? What are some ways that we can apply this here as a community, maybe in this nation, maybe with your family? Or did you see something else in the text that you want to share? What are your thoughts?
Love or intolerance. Making it a conversation maybe instead of, because people do get defensive, but maybe making it a conversation towards understanding, but also not tolerating what they're saying and let them know that you are not going to accept what they're saying.
That's true. I think there's a way to do it and not like pick up your plate and throw it at your racist uncle. That's probably not going to get anywhere, and that might get you in the back of a cop car. So don't do that. That would be a terrible way to end a Thanksgiving dinner. But maybe say something to them and just say, it's not okay that you think that way, right? For me, I had to have that conversation before with loved ones. I had to say, it's really not okay that you think this way. You don't have to raise your voice, You don't have to call them, an asshat. But you do need to say that it's not okay. And I think the issues that we have today are a result from not wanting to stir shit up at the potluck, right? Like, you don't want to cause a scene. And sometimes if you do bring something up, your family will, try to quiet you down, like, shh, don't say that. You might upset them. And I think we're so scared of those kinds of emotions in conversation that it's led to this dynamic where we can't talk about these issues, so progress never occurs. So it's okay to be uncomfortable, especially when things like tolerance and justice are concerned. So very good. What else?
Following on with what you were just saying, there was a interesting podcast by Sam Harris who was interviewing Megan Phelps-Roper.
Mm-hmm.
Megan Phelps, before she got married, she was the granddaughter of the founder of the Westboro Baptist Church.
Oh, I knew that name sounded familiar. I was like, where do I know that name?
And so, I think they have successfully managed to create a model of the very worst form of American Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
But she talks about, and she actually did a TED Talk about this, about how it was Twitter that was the sneaky little wedge into her psyche of her engagements with an Orthodox rabbi, which in Westboro Baptist land, to be anything other than a severe extreme fundamentalist is to be damned.
Mm-hmm.
And so that would certainly include, any form of Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
But he was able to interact with her gently on Twitter in ways that triggered moments of awakening that ultimately led her to leave that church and be completely ostracized by her family. And it has become a progressive hero. But at the cost of being able to interact with her family. But anyway, so along these ideas of how do you interact with people who embrace doctrines of extreme fundamentalist intolerance, she provides an example. And that's actually what her TED Talk was about.
Nice.
Was how the outside world via Twitter was able to get into her head.
Very interesting. I will have to check out that TED Talk. One of the things, and it doesn't always have like the best batting average, it's just the best method that I've come up with, is these like mic drop moments that are almost kind of instigating, like picking a fight with Republican Christians. And because of the culture in that church, they're taught to evangelize me.
Right.
So specifically, I'm like baiting them. I'm like, putting the bait out and seeing who takes a bite. Of course, they're going to come after me, and they're going to say I'm a heretic and all of these things. Then I'm like, well, can you unpack what that means? And can we talk about this? And then I will bring information to them. And sometimes, I would say it's like a 30-40% success rate, which isn't great, but it's the best one I've come up with. They'll say, I never heard this before. Can I read more about this? And then very few times, those same people, and this is an even less of a success rate, they'll come back and say, you know what, that really changed my perspective. I appreciate that. It takes time. It doesn't happen immediately. But that's the only way I've found that works for me. It's not that there's not a better way. This is just how I do it, and it works. But I challenge you, whatever way that you can penetrate the minds of closed-minded people, and there's no blueprint to it, do it. Because I think the battle that we engage in is a battlefield of the mind. And if people are closed-minded, we got to figure out how to penetrate that as best we can. And you're not always going to succeed, but never give up. This week, what stood out to me is the history of these passages being used to encourage families to stay in bad relationships or be around people that are kind of toxic. Because this week on Facebook, speaking of another social media tool, on Facebook I saw so many status updates that alluded to people that were dragging their kids to family gatherings, and they really didn't want to. And whether it was because of a creepy uncle or racist parent or sibling, these people truly wish to not be in the presence of their problematic relatives. Yet they feel obligated to be there around these toxic people. And my question is, why? Why? Now, to clarify, I'm not talking about your relative that's a somewhat reasonable Republican or Libertarian. Yes, they do exist. They do exist. They're few and far in between, but they're out there. I'm not talking about your family that's just kind of annoying, because newsflash, we're all annoying sometimes. We all annoy someone, and if you don't know anyone that's annoying in your family, you're probably the annoying one. Like, we all get on somebody's nerves. I'm talking about that straight up racist uncle. I'm talking about those family members that may have hurt you when you were a kid. I'm talking about those family members that don't accept you in your identity. I'm talking about those family members that are celebrating children being locked in cages. I'm not telling you that you should avoid, trying to reach out to them, because I think that's important, but I'm also saying that self-care is important too. And you don't have to put yourself in those situations. I mean, why do we do this to ourselves? Because of this cultural sense of obligation to tolerate the presence of hatred and cruelty, strictly because we share the same genetic sequencing as some of these folks. And if you don't have this kind of family dynamic, if you have people that are kind of problematic, but you can be around them and still, enjoy yourself, count yourself lucky, because many do not have that luxury, especially those in the margins, especially those in the LGBT community. They don't always have this luxury. So I don't know who this is for, but if you feel obligated to be around abusive people during the holidays, you don't have to take on the full responsibility in fixing broken people. That's not strictly your job. I encourage you to do it if you feel like you can take it on. I think it's important. But if you feel like it is detrimental to your mental health, if it literally harms you emotionally, don't do it. It's okay. That's on them. Because there's a cultural commitment to family regardless of their behavior, and let me tell you that I rarely see that lead to anywhere good. And one of the most powerful realizations I had as an adult was that friends are the family that you get to choose. And if you don't have a family that you're close to, look around you. I mean, this is a very small amount of the people that we usually have, but I'd like to think that we're a family here. And this is where this community comes in, because regardless of how healthy the dynamic in your family is, we are more than willing to be your family now. We love you, we accept you, we affirm you, and the only thing that we ask that you do in return is that you reciprocate that to everyone that comes inside of this community. Because as long as you can commit to accepting others as sacred children of the divine, then you are welcome and you have space here. And though this community is far from perfect, all of us are invited and welcome to the table of communion. Whether you are an atheist or a Christian, whether you are part of the LGBT community or you are straight, whether you are a person of color or you are a person of privilege, you are welcome here and affirmed. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wilderness and protect you through the storms. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to you.